Right, this is just an introduction to the basics of animation in Maya. So it just give you an intro to the time slider down here, some of the playback controls, and also a little look at the graph editor where we can edit the animation curves. So I'm just going to create a quick animation. So I'm just making a polyplane like so. I'm going to just press the T key and just get rid of the subdivisions on it. Um, like so. It will let me. That's better. Just deleted its history. I'm going to hide the grid away just to get rid of the screen clutter. So this little icon here. And lastly, whenever I do animation, any kind of scenery objects, anything that I'm not animating, I will put on a display layer so I don't accidentally keep picking it when I'm working. So look, I just create a new display layer and it adds the selected object to it. I'm going to just change this to R so I can see it, but look, I can't pick it. I'll create a cube. There it is. I'm going to turn wireframe on shaded so I can just see it a bit better, like so. Scale it up a wee bit. And I'll move it into position. And like with everything, I'm just going to quickly delete its history and I'm going to freeze its transforms so that it just sets everything back to 0 just for this cube, like so. Okay, so I'm going to do some animation on this. Okay, at the moment, look, this is the time slider. This shows me all the keys I can see at the moment. And then below it's got a range slider. So this you can adjust just to focus on a specific area of the time slider. The two input sort of boxes here just relate to each one. So the inner ones, these ones, and this one relate to the range slider. So you can type in values there, and the outer ones relate to the whole time slider. You use the range slider just so it makes it easier to edit the key. So I might set this down to say 100 at my time slider, and then I might set this down to say 30, so I can just focus on this the first sort of 30 frames. I usually have the range slider set anywhere between 50 to 100 if I'm working on character animation and just focus on those areas at a time. You can double click on this to minimize and maximize it, so that maximizes it, and double clicking minimizes it, so it's quite cool, and you can just drag it about like so. So let's lay down a key to start off with, and then we'll have a look at how to edit those keys. So with any kind of animation in 3D packages, it's a case of not pressing that button there. It's a case of you pose your character, you make sure your cursor's in the right place, you then pose your object or whatever you're working on, and make sure your cursor, like I said, is in the right place with frame 1, and then I press S, and that keys every channel, like so. And now this is important, you then move your cursor, you repose your object, and you press S again, like that. So we can then use the playback controls here, and we can have a look at the animation, like so. Okay, and then I'm just going to have this hit the ground. It's going to just slide a little bit this way, like it's going to bounce. And you don't have to work in a linear fashion. So look, I've just put this slide in, and then I'll put the bounce in here. Now the bounce, look, there's 5 frames between the landing and the slide. So I'm going to put the bounce just here. So it bounces up in the air, but the actual impact is 2 frames. So it's actually 1 frame quicker. So it's just a little bit more impact in it, hopefully. I'll just put a little bit of rotation on it. So this is the basic animation before I've made any changes to it, okay? It's okay, but there's absolutely no real weight or impact to the landing, and I'll show you why in a minute. Just as a little aside, if ever you do this, and I do this loads when I'm animating, and it's especially annoying when you're working on a complex character. So sometimes what you do is this, you start posing your character, and obviously with a complex character you can spend a good few minutes posing it, and then you suddenly realize you haven't moved your time slider, you've still left your time slider over the previous key. As soon as I move my time slider, you lose that animation, okay, because it snaps back to the key that was last placed. But if you do accidentally do that, there is a good feature, I think they introduced it a few years ago, and maybe it's been in there for years, but I only found it a few years ago, is that you can press the mouse wheel like this, the middle mouse button, and it doesn't update the animation. So it does mean that if you accidentally pose something and you haven't moved the cursor, just press the mouse wheel where you want it to be, press S, and then you don't lose your animation, you don't lose your pose, I should say. Now I want to delete that key. You can delete keys by right-clicking on them. So you go to the key like this. The key tick needs to sit so the cursor needs to sit behind the key tick. You hold the right mouse button down and you can delete. You can select keys by holding the Shift key down and just left-click on them. You can then release everything. It leaves this little highlighted bit. The outer arrows scale with 1 key. Obviously, it's got nothing to scale against, but the inner arrows will move it about like so. Okay. Be careful of scaling keys. If you scale keys, you do need to snap them afterwards. So look, there's an option here, let's snap. because scaling keys, it will let keys fall in between whole numbers. So you do need to snap them, otherwise it's hard to edit them. You'll suddenly find keys that you can't pick. So you can pick multiple keys, so if I hold shift down, it can be a little bit fiddly, but if I drag a selection box around those, I can then move all those keys about. Okay, and I can scale them like so. But you can see that the key ticks are now falling in between whole numbers. So it makes it problematic. And even if I return this back to where it was 15, if I just try and select that key there, let's just see if this works. Oh, that is working. Sometimes even when you return it to the position, you'll find it a struggle to pick the keys unless you snap them. But I think that one's working. That's okay. But I sometimes, if I've ever scaled keys, which I very rarely do, I tend to just move keys about. I will then go right click and snap. And that just makes sure they're snapped to whole numbers. So that's how you can move keys about. And like I said, right click, you can copy, paste, you can delete, snap. You can even adjust the tangents, which we're going to look at in more detail now. So as we've noticed, there's no real impact in this animation. So I'm going to bring up the graph editor. You can bring up the animation workspace if you like, but I don't like the configuration of it. I don't like the squash screen. So I'm going to just bring up the graph editor as a separate window. So in animation editors, look, graph editor here. I'm just going to have this over here. It's lovely doing animation with two monitors because you can have all this sort of clutter on one monitor and have your animation on another. In industry, they mostly have two monitors. Now, with your graph editor, if you select the animated object, you'll see all these motion curves. And with the actual object selected here in the left-hand pane, you can see all of them, and then you can just pick one at a time if you want to have a look at them. Okay, and analyze this, have a look at this, and see if you can understand what's going on. Like if we look at the translate Y, this is the up down, this is it falling through the air, landing and bouncing. This is the value of the object, so the position, is it in space or its rotation or whatever, its scale, and this is the frames. Okay, so this is how long it's taking to get from here to here. You can move stuff around in here, you can pick the curve like that, and if you want to move it about, you need to make sure you press W, so you're in move mode. But in this view, you have to press the middle mouse button, so the mouse wheel, and look, then you can drag it around, and you can see it's affecting the position of the cube because it's affecting the value, the up and down. Okay, you can then move keys about, so I can pick a key like this, I can press W, and I can move that about. And again, if I get my cursor to that position and I move that about, we can see how it's affecting the cube. Okay. If you want to move things about just in one direction, so say you wanted to just adjust the timing of this key, if you hold the shift key down and then drag, it just locks to frames, and you can see it's snapping to whole frame numbers because the snapping is turned on up here by default, and leave that turned on. So look, in that movement, if I wanted to change the value, again just drag in the vertical holding shift down, and it means you won't accidentally move the key in the frames. Okay. So hopefully that explains how you can move things about. Remember, it's all crucial. It's the middle mouse button. It's the mouse wheel. You'll notice there's a lot of stuff in here, okay? But a lot of this animation is actually, there's a lot of stuff that's not doing anything. If we have a look at the scale curves here, look, they're not doing anything at all. You can get rid of those. You can just pick them and you can delete them, like so if you want to. And you can see, look, the little red ticks disappear. It means they've got no keys there. The other way you can do it is by, if I just highlight the cube again, you can go to Edit, Delete by Type, Static channels. And static channels are keyframes that are not doing anything. They're just, there's no variation between the keys. So if I click on that, you can see again the scale disappears. So let's have a look at this. Translate X does nothing for the first 10 frames. Then where that little bounce slide along, there's some movement. Translate Y is the falling through the air. Translate Z is very similar to Translate X because there's a bit of diagonal movement. There's some movement there. And then there's a little bit of rotation and stuff like that. So you can play about with all of these if you want to, but always look at what your object's doing to check what it's doing. We want to focus on this. So look, if I look at this, we can see when we pick the curve or pick a key, you can see these are the tangent handles, these little bars sticking out. So this key here, if I pick this key and I pick this tangent handle, like so, I can middle drag that and I can adjust it. So now this is a better curve. Look, this is a slow acceleration and then goes into a constant, and there's no anticipation of hitting the ground like that. You can see that in this case, it's slowing down a little bit. And I mean, this effect is going to be very subtle, but you should notice it. Problem is, look, the tangent handles by default are joined either side. So this one will then take the cube at frame 11 or 10 through the floor, like so, which we don't want to happen. So what we can do, we can actually break the tangents in half so we can control either side. This little icon here does that, this one here. And now I can pick that one and I can adjust that accordingly, like so. And I can do the same with this one, but I can have that impact. I don't actually have to break this one because there's no subsequent keys afterwards. So that's a better shape. So let's see how that affects the animation. Let's see if the animation plays back well. Because I'm using video capture, it sometimes slows my machine down. There's a bit more impact there. That's a little bit better. If I put it in wireframe, it might play back even smoother. But it's not too bad. But you can see there's more impact in the landing. It's not such a soft landing. Okay, so that shows how the graph editor can affect things. The last thing I'll just show you quickly in the graph editor, these are all the different kinds of tangent shapes. Okay, so if you pick a motion curve, this is auto, which is the default, so it goes back to how it was. This is spline based, so it's a little bit more curved, so you'll sometimes get things going through the floor and stuff like that. There's lots of other ones, a lot I don't play about with, to be honest. This one I use a fair bit. This is linear. So if you don't want any kind of softening of the tangent, so it's just very much a constant motion. So if I change all of them to this, I pick all of those and change them all to linear, we'll see that the cube moves in a much more robotic kind of mechanical way. Okay, so all of these things make a difference. So it's worth having a play about of them all and seeing what kind of things they do. Okay, so hopefully that has just given you a basic overview of getting started with animation in Maya.